Bullets and Souls 2. Chapter 6. The Drift of Disorientation. Chapter 6. The Drift of Disorientation. On the deck where we were earlier, we could see better with the moonlight. Now we were crammed into a rubber raft that was just big enough to fit us, and it was hard to see around us anymore as the water began to fill in around us. Fleeing the big boat, I found two small wooden pulleys, one to give to Poe and Sarit, the other to hold in my own hand. The Japanese woman was holding her baby and was very weak. I observed the stars in the sky, discerned the general direction, and began to paddle up hard. We have to leave this area of the sea as soon as possible. The Sea Devil was moving fast, and those pirates were likely to catch us. The two girls, Poe and Sarit, alternated paddling on the left side, while I paddled at the same time on the right side, keeping a good consistent movement to maximize the speed of the rubber raft. The cold seawater dampened our arms, and the two little girls were tired and sweaty. After about 4 or 5 hours of paddling, the Japanese woman lifted her pale face, looked at me and then at the two girls beside her, and softly opened her mouth to speak to me. But I am not familiar with Japanese. It is difficult to understand her words. I can only try to understand. Poe and Sarit also in the side because they do not understand and anxious. The Japanese woman's lips were slightly purple. She must have felt the cold, and the baby was sleeping quietly in her arms. I spoke to the Japanese woman in stilted English, hoping she would understand so that it would be much easier to understand. I said, "Do you understand English?" The Japanese woman shook her head and then suddenly nodded her head and said, "Yes." I think she understands a very limited amount, only a few common words, and that has made us happy with each other. That communication, though raw, is at least the only way to be effective. The Japanese woman fingered her bottom and told me in one word, "Ouch." I thought it must have been hurt by the thugs on the ship when they *****ked her. When I served in a Thai mercenary regiment, I knew that some soldiers snatched refugee women to be comfort women, and when they got pregnant, they tied them to door panels and performed surgeries under harsh conditions. I know that the dehumanized Japanese invasion forces have committed such atrocious acts. But in the mercenary corps, these evil-doing soldiers no longer see themselves as living beings. I had removed shrapnel from myself with a red-hot dagger, but now I was helpless in the face of this wounded Japanese woman, and again her lower body. The Japanese woman handed the baby to Sarit to hold, and gestured to me what she meant. She wanted to immerse her lower body in seawater to wash it, and asked me to hold her upper body. I told her she couldn't do that because seawater, unlike fresh water, can cause infections when it washes over wounds. The Japanese woman understood what I meant, but still stubbornly shook her head for me to do that for her. Her body was naked when I rescued her, and now she was only draped in a soft sheepskin blanket. The blanket wasn't too big, just enough to cover the part from her breasts to her knees. I put down the wooden pulp in my hand, signaled the Japanese woman not to move, and gently held her legs with both hands, lifting her buttocks and slowly spreading them apart. Due to the heavy sea water, I struck a match, which enabled me to see the injury of her private organ. The inner lip was edematous and prominently exposed. The capillaries on either side of the pinch ooze blood, and a lot of dust and particles stick to it, making it highly susceptible to infection. Sarit's small hand touched my shoulder and held a small leather pouch with fresh water up to me. She wanted me to use the fresh water to give Japan. The woman flushed the wound. I pushed back the bag of water and told them both, "No, we could be adrift for days or half a month. If we get caught in a torrential downpour, we'll drown. And if we don't get any rain, this is the only fresh water we'll have, and it's not a risk to take." The Japanese woman could see what I was talking about with the two of them, and not agreeing to waste this precious fresh water, she begged me again to help her get down to the seawater to wash. I knew that her wound was strongly irritated by the dirt, and it must have hurt like hell. So I told the Japanese woman, "You can't wash it with seawater, and the fishy smell of your lower body with blood dissolved into the seawater will attract sharks. A small rubber raft won't do the job of protection." The Japanese woman stopped talking and closed her eyes in pain, weakening even more. I think I have to come up with a way to save her, having experienced countless lives, deaths, and bloodshed in my mercenary career. The methods of self-help on the battlefield in order to stay alive are unimaginable to the common man. It was necessary to do that to her now. I took off the sheepskin kangaroo I was wearing and put it over the Japanese woman's body. The collar corner of the kangaroo was shoved into her mouth for her to bite down on, then had Po strike a match to match the light. I spread the Japanese woman's legs and raised her arse as high as I could and buried my head to run my tongue over her wound, cleaning the blood and any dirt around it that might cause infection. My palms raked her crotch bones on either side, feeling her body jerk violently with the touch of my tongue. A guttural whimper of sadness escaped from her mouth as she bit down on the sheepskin kangaroo. The strong odor of blood and the residual cum slut after irritated my nose, and in order to thoroughly clear out the filth, I even stuck my tongue inside the crevice, towards the hook, to scrape out the substance inside that would infect the wound. I was familiar with the taste of human blood, and once on the battlefield I had been compelled by hunger and the desire to survive to eat the muscles of dead members of the war. Now, in order to keep this Japanese woman alive, I had to do so meticulously. After cleaning the dirt from the inside and the epidermis, the Japanese woman's face was oozing with sweat. I told her to keep her legs apart, not together, to facilitate air circulation to the wound. Wrapping a sheepskin blanket tightly around her splayed legs and slipping my leather kangaroo over her, the Japanese woman, much relieved of her pain, lay down in the rubber raft and fell asleep. The two men, Sarit and Po, alternated between rowing and carrying the baby. The behavior just now had surprised the two little untouched girls, and they said nothing. But I could see from their uneasy expressions that they had suffered some shock and excitement. I cupped the seawater and rinsed my mouth, then spat on my trousers, as sharks have a very keen sense of smell and I had to be careful. The darkness and watery air began to subside and I knew the sun was about to jump out of the sea, but I couldn't be sure how far away from the snow it was now and whether the raft was heading west. Po and Sarit were also tired and paddling much slower. I told them both to take a break, took the other paddle myself, and continued paddling. Escaping from the big ship, the Sea Devil was like a ticking time bomb, and I had to fight for every second. The pirate ship searched the sea for its target with great range, moved quickly, and could very well have taken our lives. It was too late for me to even take enough food and fresh water with me, and 5 people crammed into a rubber raft was already overloaded. The sun finally came out, and the white water began to steam across the bobbing sea. We were all a little more relieved, and I was starting to feel tired and wanted to stop and rest for a while. It was about 8 or 9 o'clock, and a slight sea breeze was blowing. I was happy because the wind made paddling a little easier. At that moment, the Japanese woman was awakened by the cries of her child. I thought the child must be hungry, and her face was still white, but with a little bit of life. I told her to stay still and checked her wounds first. Lifting the blanket from her legs, the thick, thin pubic hairs glistened brightly in the glaring sunlight, intertwined in the wrong places, some of them drying with my saliva. The small lips are much less swollen than last night and are beginning to shrink inwards. I nodded to the Japanese woman and told her she was getting better. She blushed, smiled absent-mindedly, and said something in Japanese. I only understood her last words of thanks, arigato. She took the baby from Po's arms, opened the sheepskin kangaroo I had put on her, pulled out a white, plump C****K, and shoved the fat brown nipple into the crying child's mouth. I gave Po and Sarit some dried fish fillets, and also gave the Japanese woman a piece of bacon. The Japanese woman was about 34 or 35 years old, with a pretty face and a plump, voluptuous body, so she must have belonged to a woman in the Japanese middle class. That's when I suddenly remembered there was a lot to ask. Po, Sarit, why are you hiding in the cabin of the Snoy instead of waiting for me to come back in town? Sarit and Po looked at each other, tears welling up in their eyes. Wayne, just after you left, bad people came to town, killing everyone they saw and robbing everything they ate. I ran to the attic to find you, just as Po was there, and we both hid in the secret room under the bed. The fire burned all night, and when we burrowed out at dawn, there was nothing left. It was all burned up. Our mom and dad were killed too. After saying this, the two girls couldn't hold back their tears any longer. I asked them both, what kind of clothes did the bad guys wear? What kind of weapons did they use? After all, the two of them were still young and couldn't speak clearly. I said to them, don't cry. Now that the few of us are drifting in the sea, we are also dying 9 deaths. If we are unlucky and can't touch the island, we will die 10 deaths. I saw many blisters on both of their small hands and knew that they were from the grinding of the wood pulp. So I cut strips of cloth from my trousers with a dagger and bandaged them separately. The Japanese woman handed me back my half-eaten bacon and told me in English words to eat it. I knew she was trying to save food so that everyone could have hope of survival. I took the small half of food and put it back in the bag, telling them I wasn't hungry. The Japanese woman continued to speak to me in English words, and from that broken conversation, learnt that her name was Ito Miyu, and that she had returned from South Africa to visit her husband and had encountered the Red Devil pirates. The passenger ship was blown up and sank. She has some understanding of this pirate organization, knowing that they are notoriously brutal, so she held her child and jumped into the sea early to escape, so as to save her from death. Later drifted in the sea for a whole day, was the snowy fished on board. We continued our search for the island, and for most of the next 2 days I paddled alone with a paddle. Poe and Sarit's hands had become too sore to hold anything. The Japanese woman was still the weakest woman on the raft, but got a little better each day. Drifting into the evening of the 3rd day, fresh water and food were gone. When I was a mercenary, I once went 7 days without food and 3 days without sticky water. It was also compelled by the harsh conditions that on the 4th day, I began to eat the muscles of the team members who had starved to death beside me. I tried to leave as much food and fresh water as I could for the 3 women, especially Miyu, needing to provide milk for the baby. My mouth was flooded with white blisters, and in the morning I moistened my mouth with my own urine to raise some spirits. Certainly have done this many times in my combat experience. I also started making all 3 of them pee into the water bag, and over the next 2 days, if they didn't, someone was sure to die. As night was approaching, there was no sign of rain, and I was anxious. Continuing to paddle the wood pulp, I prayed for a dark and ghostly island to appear in my peripheral vision. Miyu wanted to paddle for me at noon, but I didn't agree, because it's not normal physical work, and the force of her arms will make her lower body congested with blood, which is not conducive to wound healing. In this harsh environment, it is important to heal wounds as quickly as possible, and if we catch a rainstorm, we will have to go down into the sea and grab the raft. When that happens, I'm afraid the most painful thing will be Miyu. Chapter 7. An Island on the Brink of Death. I felt the wood pulp getting heavier and heavier, and most of the blisters rubbed on my palms started to bleed. Poe and Sarit came over several times to paddle, but I refused. Both of their little hands were already swollen like little buns, and Miyu leaned towards me, handing the baby in her arms to Sarit and stubbornly tugging on my arm. I still wouldn't let her do the paddling, and Miyu was so anxious that she thought I was at the end of my tether, and that I would have to die if I held on any longer. At the moment I twisted my face, she had uncovered the sheepskin kangaroo and pulled out a white, plump, held it to my mouth and kept telling me to eat it in English words. Jutting out in front of me was this brown nipple, full and round, with white juice nourished in a couple of nipple holes. I knew she wanted to nourish my dry, cracked mouth with milk to hold me up. I pointed to the baby, gesturing for her to save it for the baby. She shook her head stubbornly and touched her other C***K, trying to tell me that she had distributed the milk within her body wisely. Miyu's actions made me realize how important I was. If I fainted or died, no one on this raft would live long. I had to be awake. I was their hope. The moment my mouth opened slightly, Miyu shoved her soft nipple firmly into my mouth. At that moment, I felt all the dry insides of my body swell, and my nature dictated that my tongue and lips sucked and wrapped up desperately. Miyu is lying on her knees, holding my head tightly with her hands, squeezing my face hard with that C***K. Maybe the extreme thirst made me unable to control my strength. My mouth was completely detached from the domination of my brain, as if it was a ferocious zombie, and the greed turned crazy as soon as the young girl's blood stuck to the edge of my mouth. My whole face was buried in Miyu's soft breasts, and her body would occasionally twitch as I sucked her painfully. At this moment, I feel that the best thing in the world is the sweet milk and the satisfaction that a woman generously gives. The milk finally nourished the nerves in my brain, and consciousness dawned. Gently pushing Miyu away, the brown nipple had been sucked out of shape, sticking to the sticky saliva pumping out of my mouth. She was flushed and blushing, and her blush was so touching and flattering. I told her to lie down quickly and take care of the injury. I picked up the wood pulp again and paddled hard. Poe and Sarit saw that I was in much better spirits than earlier and looked at Miyu, who was lying down. They also followed suit and relaxed. The sunlight emitted the color of the preset mountains, making the vast wave-floating sea glow with a golden light. Suddenly, 2 seabird calls came from the sky. We raised our heads at the same time to look up, and I excitedly told them that there was probably an island nearby. But I couldn't be sure of the island's position, and if I rowed in the wrong direction, I would miss the chance to land, which would be a certain death. A sea breeze began to blow off the water, and my nose could feel the humidity in the air. I was both happy and worried that if it was a light rain, there would be fresh water to replenish and everyone could hold out longer. If it was a violent storm, the raft could easily be blown over or knocked over by the waves. At this point, we are all small, and it would be easy to be swallowed up by the huge and irritating sea. I paddled faster, trying to get lucky and find an island before it rained. Suddenly, a huge fish jumped up 30 meters from the raft, and at first everyone was stunned. When I got a good look at it, I told them not to worry. It was a huge 4-cheeked sailfish, also known as a big blue marlin, with a pointed, elongated mouth and a tall, long fin on its back that held out like a fan. I'd seen these fish before, but it was the first time I'd seen one this big. It was chasing and biting a young sea turtle, and the humid air made this sailfish so excited that it couldn't stop leaping up to the surface. I was so happy to see this. I thought if we could just get rid of the sailfish, the injured turtle would be our food. I put down the wood pulp in my hand and told Miyu to cover the baby's ears. Poe and Sarit subconsciously followed suit and covered their own ears. I drew the Lefebvre snatch that was sitting on their arse down, alongside, of course, a mill gun and 3 pistols, all of which had had their safeties pulled when I got into the raft. In the middle of the ocean, any misfire would have shot through the carrier, and we would have ended up like the raft. I was half crouched on the raft, the bobbing water making it difficult to aim accurately. As soon as the excited sailfish jumped out of the sea again, its huge body would be easily shot by me. Perhaps God was really starting to favor us, as this arrogant sailfish just hissed and bit the injured turtle, frequently leaping up high and enjoying itself, oblivious to the danger of being shot. Bang! I pulled the trigger and was certain that I had shot it, and now it stopped jumping. I lowered the gun and hurriedly paddled the rubber raft towards the injured turtle. By the time I got close, the dark green turtle was bleeding profusely and both of its hind legs had been chewed off. I fished it out with my hands. The turtle was dying. I drew my dagger and handed it to Poe so she could cut the turtle into small pieces and share them. To get them to eat the raw meat, I put 2 pieces in my mouth and chewed them first, then told them to chew more to get their taste buds used to the fishy taste. These 2 pieces of raw sea turtle meat were so crucial that they made my arms holding the wooden paddle dance much faster than before. All 3 women started out looking at each other, coyly afraid to eat, but hunger quickly conquered them. Now they laughed at each other's painful eating as they ate. This wounded turtle does bring us some cheerful anger, and in a moment when the cool rain drips into our mouths again, we'll be like the mud skippers beneath the cracked surface, irrigated and nourished with life. I told the girls to get out of the area. The smell of the turtle's blood would blow a long way with the sea breeze, and if there was a school of sharks nearby, I hoped they would all go after the bullet-riddled sailfish so we could escape. God was still displeased with us, and black clouds came from some direction and pressed over our heads. Everyone was alarmed, knowing it was going to be a storm. 1,000 meters into the raft's paddle, huge waves rose from the sea, and the child in Miyu's arms cried loudly in fear. The rain was pouring down like an overturned water basin, rushing down uncontrollably. I asked Miyu to give the baby to me, and then we all went down to the sea, holding on to the edge of the raft to prevent being washed away by the huge waves. The baby was on top of my head, and we were submerged in the sea from the shoulders down. I glanced behind me at Miyu, worried that her lower body was aching from the encroaching sea water, and Miyu nodded to me with a steely gaze. I shouted again to Poe and Sarit, "No matter how hard it gets, make sure you hold on to the raft. If you get washed away, it's very hard to get back in the pitch-black night." In unison, they both shouted to me, "We will. You take care of the kids." The next thing we knew, we were struggling in the sea, ravaged by huge waves, sea winds, torrential rain, thunder, lightning, and cold. I yelled to them again, "Hold on to the rope, try to conserve your breath and don't swim. We're just holding on now and getting through this horrible weather." The child's cries were faint in the storm, and I signaled Miyu to clamp her legs around my waist to avoid overstroking in the sea water and making her wounds talk badly. I still had the confidence to lead them along now. The 2 pieces of turtle meat and the now plentiful fresh water provided me with a lot of energy. Although we didn't feel the movement ourselves, the giant wave actually pounded us a long way. After about 3 or 4 hours, just as we were about to lose our grip, another extremely bright flash of lightning cut through the darkness of the night. "The island! It's the island! I see it!" Sarit screamed in surprise, and her shout made every one of us, who were about to give up, immediately perk up. I shouted, "Sarit, are you sure you see the island? Are you still conscious? Is it a mirage caused by hallucinations?" "No." The moment the lightning just crossed, I saw dark peaks in front of me, appearing over the sea. I was wide awake. Sarit shouted one side again. I was so excited that I shouted to them in a louder voice, "Don't give up, all cheer up. We're going to land. There's hope for us. Whoever can't hold on now, tell me, don't give up. We have discovered the island. It seems that God has been looking out for us, and the waves are pounding us, moving in just the right direction to get closer to the island. As long as we hold on to the rubber raft, we'll soon be on the island." In less than an hour's work, the Black Island was plainly before us. I shouted to the girls, "Start stirring the water gently, and watch out for the reef below, so you don't get cut." As my feet touched the soft sand of the shallow sea, the indescribable feeling of joy and triumph washed over me again. I tugged desperately at the rubber logging and stumbled towards the shore, the weight of Miyu on my back increasing. With the baby in one hand and Miyu's bum in the other, I desperately ran forward. I knew there had to be soft, sandy beaches ahead, and I couldn't wait to fall head over heels on them and sleep for 3 days and nights. Poe and Sarit, pulling the rubber raft, were running as eagerly as I was, and they both collapsed on the beach almost simultaneously, too tired to get up again. I slowly bent down and placed Miyu on the soft sandy beach and placed the baby in her arms when my brain went unconscious with a sudden burst of vertigo. Soreness instilled from head to toe. Fatigue had left me without the strength to even vomit. My stomach was churning and the acid that came up ate away at my throat. The women should have suffered the same pain as I did, their bodies writhing on the sand without the breath to let out a moan. The rain was still pouring down on us as usual, but everyone's heart was immensely collapsed, and none of us could care to express our joy of victory to each other, and we all flung ourselves down on the soft, gracious sand and did not move a muscle. Though I had fainted at the time, that was all that came to mind in the moment of unconsciousness. For I knew that the sun would wake us up tomorrow, and that the island was still waiting for us to begin to know it. Chapter 8. Entering the Primitive Ecology. A baby's cry wakes me from my drowsy sleep as the high sun shines down and the sand around me begins to emit heat. Miyu is the first to wake up and is shaking and coaxing the baby in her arms. Poe and Sarit were still unconscious, and after pushing them awake, we smiled at each other when we saw that everyone was safe and sound. However, Miyu's face turned as white as the previous days. It must have been from last night's dip in the sea. The sheepskin blanket had been lost in the ocean, and she was naked, with only a sheepskin kangaroo over her upper body. I walked by, reached out to touch Miyu's forehead and found it hot. I asked Poe to take Miyu's baby. Miyu looked at me without blinking, and I signaled with my eyes for her to lie down and put my hands on her curled-up knees and gently spread her legs. Miyu knew that I was going to examine her lower body and obeyed me gently. I pressed my hands on each of the insides of her spread thighs, observing the extent to which the injuries had deteriorated. The fuzzy hairs were messy and tangled, still a little damp, and the small lips were heavily colored, almost purple-black, and protruded outwards from their crevices. I told Poe and Sarit to get some fresh water, needed to clean Miyu. They both pulled the rubber raft over, which had rainwater that had accumulated last night. Surrounded by sand and scattered stones, there were no tools to hold the water. I tried to hold the water in my hand to help Miyu clean herself, but my fingers were too rough, and as soon as I touched her sensitive private parts, her body convulsed sharply and she shivered in pain. This was also a waste of fresh water, so I had to do the same thing I had done before. I leaned down to the bottom of the rubber raft and inhaled half a mouthful of fresh water, then brought my mouth to where Miyu was puffing up and sprayed water on it, sticking my tongue out to clean it of impurities. My nose couldn't smell the blood and sperm from last time, only the faint odor of seawater. I think the seawater just corroded the wound, and in the absence of medicine, a bacterial infection is my main concern, which could well kill Miyu. Miyu grips her hands deep into the sand and endures the pain. I try to make my tongue as soft as possible to ease her pain. After cleaning it up, tell Miyu to lie still and open her crotch as much as possible so that the sun shines on the wound and the strong ultraviolet rays can sterilize it. After rinsing my mouth with seawater, I told Sarit and Po to try to drink as much of the fresh water that had accumulated. The island was hot, and there was a lot more evaporation than when you're adrift at the surface. Miyu was already in pain and couldn't move, so I sucked up enough fresh water in my mouth, got down in front of her head and fed her through my mouth. She was the breastfeeding woman who needed fresh water the most, and I filled her stomach thoroughly with fresh water. Her tongue was very silky and made contact with mine several times. I took the baby and dipped my finger in fresh water again and dripped it into his little mouth. This little guy was also in a state of dehydration. After that, I was left to drink all the fresh water myself, although I had a very strong stomach. Sarit and Po's little faces were already red from the sun, and I looked around and realized that the island resembled a rolling mountain range, surrounded by cliffs of 50 to 60 meters. It was indeed somewhat difficult to get inside this island, and if one could not find a gap in the rolling coastline, one would be forever denied access to the outside. I was familiar with many nautical charts, but had never seen such an island on them, and I even suspected that I had traveled to another world, and that the miserly island before me was so exclusive. The sun had almost dried up Miyu's damp wounds, so I let the gas out of the raft and folded it up. Sarit and Po carried their weapons and belongings on their backs, while the other carried the baby. They had spoken very little over the past 2 days. After all, they were young and were facing a brutal life-and-death test for the first time in their lives. Miyu may not be able to walk for 3 or 2 days, so I have to carry her on my back and lead the group along the long stretch of sea line to find a breakthrough to the island. After about 4 or 5 hours of walking, an open low valley appeared before them. Great! From here we can stomp up to Yamagaki. Everyone followed suit at my words and picked up the pace. Now we finally saw a small part of the island, all lush and green everywhere, and as we looked into the distance, the gentle slopes were densely packed with shrubs, like the green ridges of a freshly sheared sheep. We walked excitedly towards the inside of the island, the shiny, oily leaves of the tropical plants glistening beside us, constantly rubbing against our bodies. Small red and yellow flowers bloomed on them, surprisingly beautiful. I'll tell you all, we don't have to worry now. There must be plenty of wild fruits and fresh plants on the island to feed the hungry. If we are lucky, we can catch animals and eat them on the grill. Everyone laughed happily at my words, the first laughter in days. Sarit and Po playfully asked me, "What if the animals eat us?" I was also amused by the two of them and told them not to worry. 3 years ago I was stranded on a deserted island once, and I stayed alone on the island for 8 months, and then I was discovered by the indigenous people and rescued me from the island, and I do know some survival experience. Miyu understood some of the words I said in English and was much relieved, wrapping her arms harder around my neck and pressing her cheek to my ear. We continued on our way. Miyu was a delicate and feminine woman, just under 160 centimeters, which would have been very tall for a Japanese woman. Her waist was slender, and although her breasts and hips were plump, they were extremely soft. What looked like a heavy woman was easy to carry on her back. I told them that it would be best to find shelter in a cave now, and that it would be much more comfortable to build a fire in it for the night. We went over 2 valleys. The ground was not very high, but it was long and vast, and it took some time to walk from here to there. As I walked up to the heights of the 3rd valley, I raised my eyes and realized that the island was even bigger than I had imagined. Dense tropical vegetation was everywhere, and it was hard to spot anything resembling a cave. We had to make our way to the slopes of the hills that were dotted with tall plants. If there was another rainstorm during the night, we could use their large leaves for shelter. The biggest concern now is Miyu. Her body must not be allowed to get wet from the rain again. My ears can fully feel her slightly burning cheeks. She is running a low fever, and her lower body needs to be kept dry and clean. In the tall woods, it was impossible to feel like you were on an island, and even I thought it was more like virgin forest. We didn't have axes or plain knives at the time. Otherwise, we could have chopped some branches and built a makeshift shack. In my military days, I was mostly in jungle combat and often caught the rain. So I was very expert at building makeshift shelters, and it was very difficult to wet the people underneath in a normal downpour. The only blunt weapons on my person right now were the 2 Swiss steel knives I had taken with me when I killed my teammate and escaped. The doors were sharp, but awkward for chopping wood. Still hoping to find shelter in a cave, I continued to lead them forward. Birds from deep out in the forest scurry back and forth, not sure if they are frightened by us or trying to scare us. I think if we never leave the island, it would be safer to build only wooden houses in the big trees. Because the ecology of this island seems so primitive right now, the likelihood of an attacking beast is extremely high. Gradually, we heard the sound of water and I glanced back at them. No one said a word, but the joy on their faces was evident. Everyone immediately picked up the pace and moved forward, guessing that it might be a waterfall or a stream pool. As it turned out, neither was as previously suspected. It was a 20-meter-wide ravine, with water flowing down the mountain cliff from far higher up. Even the highest drop was only about 10 meters. It wasn't difficult to get up to the high point of the water source, except that the rocky surface was too slippery and covered in green moss, and we were particularly tired, so we gave up on the idea for the time being. We all sat down to rest, and my whole back was covered in sweat as I was walking with Miyu on my back. I looked at the miniature waterfall 100 meters ahead, the one with the biggest drop, and wanted to go and rinse off. After placing Miyu gently on a large dry rock in Pindan, I headed towards the splashing white water. What I never expected was that God would be so gracious to us. On the rock wall next to the small waterfall, a hole 2 meters high and 5 meters wide appeared. I hurriedly ran up to see what was going on. The hole was vertically embedded in the rock wall, about 15 meters deep. The inside of the cave stayed the same size as the entrance, and the floor was flat and dry. I could hardly be more excited. Nature is so lovely. I followed the clear stream, stepping over the smooth green and black stones underneath, and made my way back to where they were sitting and resting. Come on, you guys. Come with me, we have a good place to settle down tonight. With that, I pulled Miyu up and carried her on my back towards the excellent cave. Sarit and Po followed me, carrying the baby in their arms. I kept turning around and telling them to watch out for the rocks under their feet and not to slip. By the time we were all inside the cave, everyone was happy and the smiles on their faces showed satisfaction. I told them to make a rest while I went out to get some dry branches for the fire. It felt much easier to be out of the cave alone. I broke a lot of dry, thin twiggy poles in the nearby bushes, tied them into large bundles with vines, and carried them back. On the way, I used my dagger to sharpen some leafy branches in passing, so that back at the cave I could sweep the ground for stones and bits of bird droppings. All 3 women were very happy to see me back. Po and Sarit took the dry firewood I was carrying. I tied the branches together and asked Sarit to clean the floor. Miyu was lying asleep on the deflated rubber raft. I went over and felt her forehead. Luckily, the temperature hadn't risen, which meant that she hadn't been infected by bacteria down there. Sarit and Po quickly cleared the floor of the cave. The next step was to build a fire. I walked out of the cave and picked up a few rocks from the nearby stream. In the center of the cave, I formed a small circle around the stones, grabbed some small drywood sticks and placed them in a pile in the circle. Afterwards, a pistol was taken and a bullet removed, and the powder in it was cut out with a dagger and spread on a flat stone before it was leaned into the small wood pile in the center. I told Po and Sarit, one to plug the kid's ears and one to help Miyu cover her ears. After loading the clip back into the pistol, a shot was fired at the gunpowder on the stone surface. The bullet refracted to the outside of the cave, and the gunpowder on it roared to life, igniting the pile of dry wood. It wasn't the first time I'd done this. Building fires with weapons had been done countless times in my military career. Several of the women laughed as they watched the burning fire, especially when Miyu woke up and saw the bonfire. The absent, smiling demeanor was extremely moving. Chapter 9. The Beast That Attacks in the Dead of Night. There are fish in the stream. I'll catch a few and have a hot cooked meal. Everyone smiled and nodded after hearing my words, and it seemed that they were all afraid of the taste of eating raw turtle meat. On the way back from carrying firewood, I followed the stream upwards so as not to get lost. On the way, we saw a few greenish-colored trout swimming against the current in a clear, shallow stream. If we can catch a few before it gets dark, we can all go to bed with full bellies. Especially Miyu's body can't afford to starve. Following the stream, I came to the spot where I had just seen the trout. The 4 or 5 dodgy ones were still wagging their tails vigorously, trying to swim back to the source. In front of them is a small waterfall 10 meters high, but they don't know the meaning of predestination. As soon as it gets dark, they are washed downstream again, and when it gets light, they start swimming against the flow in groups again, day after day, for who knows how long in vain. To prevent them from turning around and escaping, I yard up a lot of rocks in the narrow part of the downstream stream. The water flowed through as usual, but it was a dead end for those trout. Once ready, I folded a 2-meter pole, gingerly made my way to the vicinity of the trout, and swung down on the biggest of them. As the stream was shallow, it was easy to knock the fish over at once with a wooden stick. The largest trout was hit. Its greenish-black skull and spine turned white and blood scattered from its gills. I think the swim bladder in its belly that controls its balance must have been broken by me, and it floated on its back, drifting downstream with the current. I left it alone. A barricaded rock would have intercepted it anyway. A couple of the others were spooked and turned tail and ran downstream, which was pretty fast compared to swimming against the tide. I chased them down the stream again, and the fleeing trout were even more anxious as they found the sudden emergence of the rocky basement wall, and reversed their tails to swim back against the current, but at a pitifully slow pace. I swung my stick and delivered a few more hard blows, and all these foolish fellows, like the first, rolled over on their bellies and squeezed into the gap where the stone barricade stopped them. By this time it was getting dark, so I picked them up and headed back. These trout didn't look like much in the water, but they were thick in my hand. I think tonight must have been a feast that God intended for us. They were very happy to see me return with lots of big fish. This island is very hot during the day and sometimes cool at night. I brought Miyu close to the fire to keep her warm, and Sarit and Po gathered round. I use a dagger to cut clean strips of wood and cut them into 4 sections, each with a point cut out of one end for threading the fish through the grill. Sarit and Po each hold up a large fish in their hands to turn and grill. I take 2, one for Miyu. Each woman was smiling, but not speaking. I then said to the women, "The stream is long. There are plenty of fish to eat in it, and fresh water is no longer a problem. Whether we can get back to land or not is not important first. At least we have a good chance of surviving now." Several of them nodded their heads, still smiling after looking at each other. I could tell they were quite happy with their current situation. The fish quickly roasted out the oil, bubbling nastily over the fire. The aroma of the fish filled the air around us, and everyone involuntarily made gagging noises. Sarit and Po started to eat the fish with their little hands, pinching the meat on the stick. Both of them looked at each other and smiled while eating like 2 naughty kids. I told them to grill it for a while longer so that they wouldn't eat it, but they smiled at me and ate it as usual. I also laughed out loud at the hungry eating of the 2 of them. The very large and fat trout was almost done grilling, and I handed it to Miyu, telling her to eat it slowly and be careful of burning it. Miyu looked at me tenderly, took the grilled fish, pinched off the flesh with her white, slender fingers, and ate it in small bites. I cut the other grilled fish with a dagger and ate it, because the fish was too hot for me to open my mouth and bite, and I wasn't used to crossing my fingers and pinching it like they did. I told them that there is a lot of artemisia on this island. Tomorrow I will cut some and dry it in half a day if there is enough sunlight. Then I will bring it back at night to make a mattress, so that I can sleep comfortably on it. The grilled fish was soon finished by us, and Po and Sarit's little mouths were as black as a flower cat's. They both said before they went to bed that they were going to take a bath in the stream. They did get so dirty. I was afraid that the 2 of them were in danger, so I accompanied them. Out of the cave, the moon was big and full. High above the island, and the line of sight was fine. The two of them were washing right next to the cave entrance, and if they went too far, they would not be able to take care of Miyu. Po was wrapped in a shabby and greasy sheepskin jacket that framed her pale neck. Sarit wore a cotton shirt and trousers that made her limbs look extraordinarily elongated because she had grown up so fast and had no proper clothes to replace them with. I sat on a rock by the stream with the Milita gun in my lap. If any ferocious beasts pounced, I could easily shoot them and protect the two tender girls. At first, the two little girls were a little embarrassed, glancing at me and then at each other, sneering. I told them not to hesitate, seize the time to wash. I still do not understand the surroundings, whether there is a crisis lurking, and how big a crisis are now unknown. Not to be careless. The two little girls obeyed and began to take off their clothes. I said, "Don't get your clothes wet. Wait until daylight when there is sunlight. Just wash your body now." Po unzipped her sheepskin jacket, and her slender white back was on display for me to see. She was still young. Her breasts had only recently risen, and she had no soft clothing such as a bra. Underneath, she had only a pair of thin cotton trousers, the tattered legs of which had become so short that they did not cover her straight calves below the knee. Sarit also unbuttons her blouse, and a strip of white peri-breast cloth wraps tightly around the pair of proud. Though the is erect and high, her owner is my fiancée, and the arrogance can't find any sense of superiority over me. Po's cotton trousers had come off, and her round little bottom, which had not yet grown into the provocative contours of a mature woman, was white and soft in the glow of the moonlight. Sarit was holding her cotton jacket and bib in one hand and tugging her trousers down over her raised feet. She was 3 years older than Po, and her physique was out and out feminine. Her arse was full and ample, with soft, defined contours. The two girls looked at me. I looked at you. Naked. For a moment they didn't know where to put the clothes in their hands. "Bring me the clothes, don't put them around. Bugs and snakes or something like that can crawl in and sting you," I said to them in a voice as low as I could while inspecting the surrounding movements with my eyes. I felt like I was back in the jungle battlefield of my day. The two girls stumbled towards me, their feet treading carefully in the stream. In fact, after they both experienced the scene where I cleaned Miyu's wound, their maidenly reserve had tightened up a lot. Sarit walked to me, a naked white body. Her right hand a little subconsciously covered the thin, tender, soft pubic hair. The moonlight is hazy. Her flesh seems like white cream congealed, steeply upturned little. A pair of flesh-red pink nipples straight into my eyes. I reached out to take the clothes she handed me, and a body odor rushed into my sense of smell, the faint smell of urine emanating from her private parts. A 16-year-old girl. It is the stage of active physiological development, and a few days with me to suffer all the hardships, and now finally can wash the shameful private unspeakable. I don't know why, but the faint smell of urine rushed into my brain, dispelling some of my years of despondency and loneliness on this island of oblivion. A call to a man's home. Po followed Sarit's lead, handing me the parka and cotton trousers, one small hand covering her breasts and her privates at the same time, juggling the sights I cast on her from side to side. I looked her in the eye for a moment as I took her clothes, and she instantly realized that she shouldn't have panicked like that, dropping her slender arms and pulling Sarit towards the middle of the stream. Po's mom told me at first that her daughter looked like a big girl. Now that I think about it, my heart wells up with pity for Po. Her slightly bulging breasts, nipples still retaining their childlike appearance, her belly flat and tender under the bright moonlight, and barely visible hair on her bare pubic mound. The stream was rushing. The two girls were bending down to wash their long hair. The back of their long, soft necks bowed out in two curved lines, their two snow-white hips swaying on the water, a large and a small one extremely beautiful. I still kept cruising around. The beasts of the jungle were extremely silent and stealthy before they attacked. I had to detect it in advance and scare them away. Otherwise, once it scurries out and pounces on the two girls, it is too late to protect and shoot. I remember one of my own teammates was not paying attention to the back during a jungle ambush and was bitten off in the shoulder by a leopard that scurried out. Although that leopard was eventually daggered to death, his arm was completely crippled. Sarit and Po had begun to crouch down to wash, both their right hands reaching into the stream at their crotches, and from the shrug of their shoulders I knew it was washing their private organs. And there was something so lovely and serious about the manner and movement of the washing. After a while, the two cleaned their whole bodies and started walking towards me. I shoved my clothes to them and took out my dagger to chop off 2 huge banana leaves behind me. Miyu was now unable to walk, and her private parts were afraid of water. I'll use the leaves to fill them with clear stream water and bring them back for her to drink some or wash her face. It was obvious that the girls loved to be clean, especially Po and Sarit, who had been washed and were happily combing their hair with their hands around the campfire. Miyu drank some, and then cupped his hands and washed his face, and his face was much more radiant, hanging drops of water on the face of the delicate and charming, filled with the charm of a mature woman. The rubber raft was big enough to lay flat on the rocks to enable Po and Sarit to sleep on it as well, and Miyu beckoned me over to huddle with them. I shook my head and Miyu took it the wrong way, thinking it was because I was embarrassed to sleep cramped up against a woman, making hugging gestures again, telling me not to be shy. I knew she was concerned about me, and I was all too eager to lie down on a soft rubber raft and sleep until morning, but I knew that would be dangerous. I smiled at Miyu, patted the dense forest gun I was carrying in my arms, and pointed a finger at the darkness outside the cave, telling her I had to keep watch over the campfire and sit down to rest. In case any danger rushes in, I can't protect everyone in time, so sleep in peace. Miyu understood what I meant, and after gazing at me for a while, she laid down. I leaned against the campfire and gazed out into the darkness. Thoughts disconnected from my brain. I had no purpose now, no idea what I was going to encounter tomorrow. Maybe we would live on the island for the rest of our lives. But it is now my duty to keep the 3 women and the baby safe. Without them, this place will undoubtedly become a hell for my soul. Chapter 10. Food in Peril. Sitting by the campfire in the cave, I could see the stars vaguely outside. Most of the night had passed and the fire was roasting me so warmly that my eyes were a little too strong and tired to close together. Suddenly, I heard a stream splash outside, and at first thought it was the trout downstream foolishly backtracking again. But the sound of lapping water, one after the other, alerted me immediately. Maybe it was a very large animal playing in the water, or chasing prey. The sound of the water grew louder and closer. I hurriedly left the campfire and half-crouched under the rock wall to my right, switching on the safety of my Milita gun and aiming out of the cave entrance. My heart was also tense. If it was the savages on the island and I shot them, it would be easy to cause misunderstanding and hatred. If I did not shoot them, I could easily be harmed by them as well. The hazy moonlight outside the cave faded and the boulders around us were nothing but pitch black. My heart raced and I aimed out without blinking. The sound of water had rung up to the mouth of the cave, and a fleshy black shadow appeared in my point of aim. I can tell from the shape of the dark figure that it is not a savage, but presumably a mangabade leopard or a large boar. If it dares to walk in, I will not hesitate to shoot the impudent fellow. Instead, it stopped at the mouth of the cave, its eyes fixed on the campfire. In the faint light, I could see its silver-gray eyes gleaming. It shifted its bulky body from side to side, adjusting its posture as the fierce light in its eyes began to reveal itself. Finally got a good look at it. It was a young wild mountain bear. It probably caught fish for dinner in the stream at night, didn't find any, and sniffed the smell of baked fish to find its way to this cave. It was already on its back, ready to pounce on the women sleeping beside me. I mustn't give it any chance. Bears are lethal. Whether it's clawed or tongued, it could be fatal. I adjusted my aiming star to the eye it was facing me in, hoping to knock it away or blind it. It reminded me of shooting an American agent in the temple during a mission in Thailand. It was 1,000 meters away, and the bullet managed to get into his ear, and the shot was successful. It wasn't difficult to single-fire the eye of this 10-meter wild bear with a dense forest gun now. The bullet ripped right through its eye after I keyed the trigger, black blood mixed with silver and gray crushed eyeballs crashing onto the rock. It didn't run away, and I think the bullet may have damaged its brain tissue directly, and wailed shrilly as it tumbled through the hole and kept hitting the rocks. All 3 women sat up at the same time in terror and let out a scream. The baby also began to cry, and Miyu began to soothe the child once she knew the danger had been removed. It's all right, a newly grown wild bear, probably sniffed out food and is now dead. Don't be afraid. After saying that, I sat back down by the fire again. Poe and Sarit's eyes were still flashing with panic, and I gave them both a look, adding, "It's still light out, so go back to sleep. This is no more than a house, and it's not surprising to see beasts come in, so just get used to it." They went back to sleep on, and the wild bear broke off in a moment, ceasing to hiss and twitch. I did not go to drag it, for the light was now too low, and the neighborhood of the cave was still dangerous, and it would be sensible to wait until daylight to see what was going on. I don't think it's a good idea to go on like this. My body can't take it every night on such a vigil. Tomorrow the women's business should be to do the washing up, and I'm going to get a lot of hay to lay in the hole and a way to make a strong gate. The door blocks or delays the rattling when something tries to get in during the night. Soon the stars outside disappeared. The fish-belly white of the eastern part of the sky spread its bright light over the mouth of the cave, and the chirping of various birds began again. I came out with my gun and dagger and found that it was a bear of silver-gray fur, long, fat, and sturdy. One of the eye sockets on its head had been blown a black hole by a bullet, and the colors black and red and green were twisted together. The bear's blood on the ground had run long enough to melt into the stream. The bear wasn't too heavy, and I could barely drag it. After dragging the bear into the stream, I began to skin it and remove the flesh. The dagger was sharp and easily cut off the entire bearskin, which was washed clean in the stream and spread on a large, bland rock to wait for the sun to come out and expose it. My hands and arms were covered with scarlet bear's blood, which recalled to me many a battlefield tear. The next step was to cut the meat, and I cut off the robust, fat part of the bear piece by piece, and also spread it out on the rocks to cool in the sun, as dried meat is not liable to spoil. It wasn't until the sun was high in the sky that I felt my back shine uncomfortably hot. The rock around me was drier at this point, making it easy to step on and climb. So I tossed the bear's bloody skeleton up to the top of the 10-meter high waterfall and then climbed up myself. One is to observe the surrounding terrain, and the other is to throw the skeletons that tend to attract fierce beasts into the sea under the cliff. When I got on, it did surprise me again. The other side of this island was a vast tropical rainforest. An open river like a thick python coiled over the thick green grass. Far from seeing the end, the forest could not be seen. Behind me were valleys of heavy falls that stretched far and wide. It doesn't look like an island to me. Maybe it's the edge of the land. We're on the edge of this vast and magnificent rainforest. After looking around the terrain and throwing away the remains of the bear, I tumbled back into the cave. Sarit and Poe were already standing at the entrance of the cave, looking at the animal skins and chunks of meat on the rocks next to them in amazement. At night you two sleep on the bearskin. It's not comfortable to always sleep crammed together. Later I'll go and get some dried artemisia grass to lay in the cave at night. Looking at these two girls, they looked much better, and their faces still had the charming, tired look of a young girl. The two girls looked at me and Sarit spoke. "Get some rest. You haven't slept well all night. Artemisia and I will go and cut some back by Poe." I said no. Right now you guys don't know your surroundings well enough to be in danger. Wait until later to do it alone. You two stay in the cave to take care of me. I'll be nearby. Whenever there's a situation, shout loudly. I can't hear you. There is a pistol under the rock wall to the right of the campfire. Remember how to use it. Don't shoot randomly. Save bullets. As I spoke to them, I stirred up water to wash away the rocks where the animal's blood had stuck to prevent the lingering odor from attracting trouble. Sarit and Poe also brought branches to help with the scrubbing. I said, "You two take a few pieces of meat in to roast and watch over the fire." With that said, I turned and headed for the Artemisian grassy hillside, slung my milita, 2 daggers bound to my calves. Poe ran over to me and tugged on my arm. I turned my head to look at her. She didn't say a word. I asked Poe, "What's wrong?" She still didn't say anything. Her eyes held tears. I stroked her head and told her not to be afraid. I won't go far and I'm not likely to leave them behind. I'm armed. Don't you worry about me. She nodded. It seemed she was frightened by last night's bear kill. After all, she was still young. 200 meters from the mouth of the cave, the stream gully was wide, and a small shoal formed around it. Lush artemisia grass grew on the damp mud. I drew my dagger and began to cut. the grass, although it was inconvenient, but the sharp blade could easily cut the thin stems. In about an hour's work, there were 2 large bundles of grass high up. I cut some vines to pack the grass, just like I used to pack a rucksack when I was a mercenary. Soon I was back at the entrance of the cave carrying 2 big bags, and Sarit and Po were roasting cooked meat in the cave. I could smell the food from the cave air. Po came running out, happy to see me back so soon. She said, "Let me help you." I said okay. So the 2 of us spread out the artemisia on the sunburnt and somewhat hot rocks to cool off. That's when Sarit called out from the cave, "The meat is ready. Come in and eat." Po and I smiled at each other and walked back to the cave together. Miyu was already sitting up with the baby in her arms. I touched her forehead and realized that the fever had gone down and she was back to her normal temperature. Sarit took the baby and I picked up Miyu and walked outside the cave entrance to the clear stream. Miyu was so happy that it was the first time she came out for air since she entered this cave. Her soft arms were wrapped around my neck and her fair face was shining brightly in the sunlight. I half squatted in the middle of the stream and made Miyu lie on her back on my legs so that she could wash her hair with her own hands. The cool stream washes her long silky hair as it floats in the water. There is probably a volcanic crater near this island, and the air is relatively high in sulfur, and much of what comes down is acid rain. So, hold Miyu out and let her wash off the residual acid in her hair. Miyu washes while looking at me, blushing and smiling. Her lower body is naked, her slender and voluptuous legs are white and dazzling in the sunlight, and the dark and fine velvet hair under her belly, shining brightly, exudes the temptation of a mature woman. Her upper sheepskin kangaroo was open, and her engorged Snow White stood up high, swaying in her ecstasy-scented arms. A large brown nipple, indicative of infinite nurturing, was full of white juice and generously displayed in the sunlight. Miyu must be a woman who is very afraid of getting dirty. She washed her hair for a long time before signaling for me to carry her up. I rubbed my wet feet against a pindan rock a few times as it was a bit too hot to put a bare-bottomed Miyu directly on it. After my feet felt warm enough, I placed Miyu gently on the rock and signaled her to lie down slowly. She obeyed my words and gently lay down. I moved her white, plump legs, and she met me by curling up her calves. After slowly spreading them apart, I saw the injured area. The pubic hairs were fluffy and spread out in all directions. The 2 little lips were twisted together and retracted back into the slit a lot, and the color had shifted back to a fleshy brown from yesterday's black and purple. At this point, Miyu had her hands over her eyes and was looking at me through the gap in her fingers with a flushed, yummy smile on her face. I was just about to gently lower her legs when she grabbed one of my wrists and told me to pee in English words. Her wounds don't recover easily from sticky water and have to be kept as dry as possible. I then squatted down on her side, my left arm braced to support her legs, and the thumb and middle finger of my right hand carefully went apart her fleshy little lips on both sides so that her urethra was as exposed as possible. I nodded to Miyu and told her it was ready. At that moment, Miyu narrowed her eyes slightly, and with a contraction of her smooth and delicate belly, a shot of brownish-yellow urine shot out in an arc, and the clear stream at her feet caught the strange color and drifted downstream. The distinctive scent of a woman's private parts and the smell of hot, wet urine filled my surroundings, and a motherly, mature beauty flowed out into the sunlight in a flash. When I was done, I put Miyu's white thighs in the stream to clean them, knowing she liked to clean them, so I teased some water up with my hand and rubbed the mud off them with my palm. Miyu had been following every move I made to clean her with tender eyes. When I helped her to take off the sheepskin kangaroo, her pair of full and plump immediately jumped out and fluttered twice in front of her pink neck. Even Miyu herself was embarrassed to control her with her hands so that it wouldn't wiggle. I leaned Miyu back so that her legs could spread themselves out on the rocks, allowing the sun's UV rays to sterilize her private parts as strongly as possible. And I took the sheepskin kangaroo and shuffled it vigorously in the middle of the stream. For the sunlight now would make any laundry that was washed dry quickly, so that Miyu would be much more comfortable when she slept again at night.